Hi, welcome to this section on Christianity. My name is Dick Shager, and I guess we can introduce ourselves because we're no strangers to doing these shows for Channel 15. So,
my name's Dan Bruch. I've known Mr. Shager for quite some time. We have rural roots, both of us, and a similar passion for remembering that the common good is what we're all working for, and so I'm excited to be involved in this conversation. A retired pastor from Hudson, Wisconsin.
And I guess I'm the one that's going to do some of the leading in terms of the discussion, in terms of getting it going. And you're a pastor, the topic is labor and the morals of labor. So I'm going to rely on you to give a lot of the answers. And I want to start by going back in history. My great-great-grandparents and my great-grandparents came to Wisconsin in 1848 and 1850 from Norway, and of course they were farmers. They had to come because they were starving in Norway. And all of Europe was starving in the 1840s. So it wasn't that they had this grandiose idea of making wealth. It was to feed their families and have an opportunity. And as farmers, they were, of course, mainly to get enough food, raise a little bit of chickens and eggs, and they sold the cream for money. The money, all they needed was for clothes and to buy coffee, and they didn't even need flour, but some flour, and sugar and spices. Otherwise, they were self-sufficient. Now, at that time, and that's where the Norwegian Lutheran Church, by the way, started down in Ortfordsville, Wisconsin, way in southern Wisconsin, back in 1853. But at that time, most of the little churches in the countryside were all farmers. And all the sermons, and I think it's still true today because we got a lot of farming here and a lot of small churches in western Wisconsin, were preached on the fact that farming was the basis for what they always were talking about. So Dan, what is some of those, or what are some of those references in the Bible to farming as a part of moralness?
Well, excuse me. You know what? I think what we're really focusing on is the morality of work, and because there is a strong moral component to work. Moral being defined as something to which we apply a value of good, something that enhances the common good when we talk about issues of morality. And labor is certainly one of those. Work is certainly one of those. The same word in the Old Testament that is used for God working, as he did when he created the earth, is the same that's used for humans working. It's a part of the of creation to have work as a component of it. And so while from a theological point of view, from time to time there have been those who thought that work was a part of the curse of the fall, for those of you who come from a Christian tradition, the reality is that it's not that work was a part of the curse of the fall. It's just that work, which is always defined in the Bible as something positive, was affected by the fall. So that work, rather than always being something that was looked upon pleasurably, became something that had some negatives attached to it. Not the work itself, but the fall attached the growing of weeds and brambles and things like that, so that it wasn't as easy for your work to produce the things you were looking for after the fall. But the concept of work is a part of the created order and is always defined as something that is good, and something that enhances the human rather than detracts from the human. And whether you happen to be Lutheran or Methodist or Episcopal or any of the Christian faiths, Catholic, the theological perspective is always consistently the same. That work is God-given, something we are called to do, because one, it enhances ourself, and two, it provides good to others. So the only negative things in the Bible about work are about those who refuse to work, or those who take advantage of those who do work. So there are negatives about it in the Bible, but not about the concept of work itself, which is always considered to be a blessing of God to help fulfill ourselves and to serve as a vehicle for helping others.
Yeah, and that's why, from the very beginning, there was so much agriculture references in the Bible. And, you know, even Ruth gleaning the fields of wheat, and there are many hymns, and in the New Testament and so forth. And so I was raised on a farm, so, I mean, I can still relate to a lot of that. But all of a sudden, we came to the 1900s, and people were moving from the farms to the cities and having labor, if we want to call it that, jobs in factories and other than farm work. And now all of a sudden those references aren't as meaningful. And so what should we be talking about when we're talking about the morals of, let's say, common labor to begin with, and then we'll go on to other labor?
Well, again, you know, other than, again, affirming that the consistent perspective of the Christian faith is to affirm work as God-given, that regardless of the kind of work you do, as we do it for the glory of God and the welfare of our fellow humans, God defines it all as positive and of equal value. And just as an aside, you know, it always has sort of stunned me in some ways that it's very often not the church that has the best perspective on the morality of work. Often it's people outside of the church. For example, I think the person that most influenced my own thinking, and I know this may be a turnoff to some of the people who hear this, is Karl Marx, who incidentally was confirmed as a Lutheran. I don't know if you knew that. His mother was a Lutheran, his father was a Jewish, and he fell away from the faith later. But here was his take on work. He said there's a difference between work and job. Working fulfills the human spirit. It helps you to grow, to have self-esteem, and it helps others. Jobbing, as he called it, is something you just do to have to make a living to survive. And what his perspective was, which happens to be a Christian perspective, is that whether you're an employer or employee, work always ought to be work, something that enhances the self, makes you feel good about yourself, gives you the opportunity to support your family and others. And jobbing is something to be avoided. In this day and time, talking about morality, we are having much more jobbing and much less working. The morality of what's going on in the labor market now is that we have the highest rate of unemployment almost ever among certain groups. Black youth, 50%, dropped to 40 recently only because they quit looking for work. Among Latino youth, when you add the unemployed and the underemployed in there across the whole culture, we're over 20%. And in many cases, this is higher than the countries in the Middle East that are undergoing transitions now, in large part because the culture was not employing enough people. So I think Marx had it right. We want people to find good work, and insofar as possible for the culture to avoid the jobbing, which is where we are now.
Therefore, work always has an emotional component to it. Because if you're really working, you're enjoying it, you want to do it, you will be thinking about it, even when you shouldn't be thinking about it, like at night you want to do something else. It's there because it's something that you want to do, and you feel it, whether it's a calling, which we know there are many references to a calling in the Bible. You have that emotional part. So when you have other people or groups of people or government, etc., that want to demean your kind of work, you are really going against what work really is and what God-given work is.
Yes, you are. You know, I think back from time to time when I first got into university teaching. First of all, the only reason I got into it is predominantly because of a matter of birth. The family I was born into, the attitudes that were passed on to me through socialization in support of education, the attitudes that I was socialized in with regard to hard work and persistence throughout a project. So it's not anything inherent within me as much as it is that I happen to be born at a right time with the right circumstances in the right family.
Yep.
So that the first few years I was in college teaching, I actually carried a burden of guilt because I enjoyed it so much. I felt, why am I getting paid for it? I was embarrassed at getting paid. And then I thought, this is what Karl Marx was talking about, that you have something that enhances your own spirit. And in doing so, gives you the ability to affirm and help others around you too. And that really fits the biblical image of why God created work, not only to produce food and other things for sustenance, but also to self-fulfill the human spirit, and in doing so, to affect those positively around you too. So yes, I think we could say when our culture has moved, as it has in the last 30 years, to demeaning certain types of work, and especially demeaning workers who are simply trying to develop a work situation that enhances them and helps them to enjoy their work and thus pass that on to others. As that has diminished, we can, I think, say that the country has diminished in the morality of our view toward work and workers. So that now in the public arena, we see vilification of teachers and policemen and EMT people and fire people and all the public servants in the government, some of whom I'm sure do take advantage of it, but the overwhelming majority of whom do not. This diminishes a culture that's based more on an idea than anything else. And the idea is that everybody should have an opportunity to do the work that they do best, that most enhances the common good, that somehow working together as a unit builds the culture. Right now, we have a public attitude that is diminishing the culture, separating one group from another. And for anybody to suggest that somehow this is a moral thing is beyond my ability to understand. It's immoral on so many levels. One, to ever demean a group for one reason or another, but especially a group that is involved in work that has the sole purpose of enhancing the common good. And those are really the only ones who are being demeaned these days. Nobody seems to be demeaning the people who, the top 1% or 2 or 3 or 4% who are receiving all the wealth at the expense of those who are working so hard, the other 95%, to produce that wealth that then goes through their hands right to the 5% above. This is immoral.
So basically, as a society, if we just forgot about the economic numbers and concentrated on enhancing all people, no matter what they do, whether you call it labor or whether you call it whatever, we would be building our society rather than tearing it down. And it's sort of insidious, isn't it? Because it's such a slow process that we forget about what's going on. I'm always thinking about, now we're talking about the people who come from foreign countries, and all of a sudden they do really well in school, and then they go back to their other countries. Well, to me, it's like, yes, that's happening because we have, at a very early age, really cut off the chances of more people learning math and science and English and whatever, so that we don't have our own people coming into those opportunities. And it isn't that the people coming from abroad are any smarter than the Americans. It's that we are just depriving our society, in my viewpoint, and therefore depriving what God wants us to do of all our opportunities. And I just think that, it's my personal view, if we don't change that, we are in for a huge, huge awakening of some sort.
So how would you say we're depriving? What are the factors leading to the deprivation of American youth to have the same school opportunities I had in the 40s and 50s and 60s?
Well, one thing, we have to help the poor. We've known for a long time that the intellectual ability has no boundaries in terms of social and economic status. So the minute we diminish or don't help the poor, and you talked about minorities, we are automatically just forgetting about a certain number of kids that would become very, very talented and very productive in these advanced society that we're going to need in order to keep up with the world. Now we're worried about the rest of the world is all catching up to us. Guess what they're not doing? They're not doing what you're talking about. They're enhancing everybody instead of, in fact, I think it's going to be interesting with the Chinese to watch, because they're going to have about 300 million, if my numbers are correct, people moving from the farms, which is what I started with, to the industrial society in the next 10 years. That's about the same number, or almost the same number of people that's in the United States. And the question's going to become, for them, exactly what you're talking about. How are they going to handle that? And I don't know Buddhism and the other main religions that are there, but if they don't, I shouldn't say glorify, but not diminish those people who are doing that, they're going to lose eventually too. Don't you agree?
I agree. You know, we are now among the most unequal countries in the world, which is a tragic situation for a country like ours, who as recently as 30 to 40 years ago was considered to be among the most equal countries in the world. A part of that process is to increase the number of people who are living at or below the poverty line. And it's not due to a lack of money in this country. It's not due to a lack of productivity. We are the most productive country still on the planet, with the most money available to the culture, the great majority of it which in the hands of a very few that is not being used for the common good. Yeah. And we know, as you have pointed out, that the single most important factor in school performance is poverty. And that's a complex of reasons for it, but the less poverty there is in a school, the better the students do. Of course, we are not much concerned in this culture at this point on how we deal with the poor, even though of all the subjects in the Bible, the two that are dealt with the most are helping the poor, the powerless, the disenfranchised, and money and how we use it. Yeah. And those are also the two ingredients that our culture has the least interest in pursuing. I think what I was getting at, however, when you compare some children and their success with others, and I know I'm not the interviewer here, but I have an honest question, not only for you, but for whoever may watch this. It was 40 years ago now that I taught my first course in the sociology of education. And at that time, I already told the students, there is something that is going on now that is detrimental to our educational system, And here's what it is. The schools have increasingly taken over parental responsibilities.
Yes.
And the schools haven't asked for it. The schools haven't wanted it.
Yep.
But it has been forced upon them, much as policemen, who are law enforcers, spend very little time enforcing the laws and way too much doing social work.
Yes.
The schools have become an agency where culture has demanded of them something that is not their primary responsibility.
Right.
So at that time already, the school was providing food for poor who couldn't afford it, health care for those who couldn't afford it, discipline, a value organization. And it has only increased over these 40 years, so that the schools find themselves, much as a policeman, spending way too much of their time on the things that they are not trained for necessarily and should not be involved in, namely the parental responsibilities of discipline, how you treat your teachers, how you treat others around you, how you develop civil behavior, kind, gentle, all those values. Food, good food that looks out for the strength of your body and the maturity of it as it goes through the life cycle. Health care, and the list could go on. So my question is, if we are going to recommit ourselves to educating children properly, would you also suggest that we have to start focusing on two things, poverty and parental responsibility in child rearing?
I agree totally. And when you talk about all these other factors that we started to and are still doing, we've backed off a little bit on some of them, all that means is we are taking time away from academic excellence at the same time. And what we're talking about to succeed and stay ahead of the curve, which we're worried about now because all these countries are doing better on tests than us, and they're starting to get ahead of us, and their economies are getting close to ours, and even Europe coming together as one unit is approximately the same size as the United States in terms of population. And actually, they have worked through some of those and are on the other side of the curve now, and going to, and that's why they're scoring higher than us, especially Finland. We're going to have to go to that, what you're talking about, the parental responsibilities so we don't have to be the cops in the school and all that stuff in order to free up time to really teach. And I believe teachers, and I know it because and my wife's a teacher, and when there was a demagoguery for the teaching profession here late this spring, it was just, you could feel it. And it was hard for her to go to work because you could feel it. Everybody in the school could feel it. And that has an effect. That also has effect on who you're teaching. Even though you might teach them all the specifics of the numbers and the concepts and all that other stuff. But yes, we have to do that. We have to, and every profession has to be revered. And all work has to be revered. And I think we have to also get away therefore, because here, we're not talking a specific Christian background, we're talking Christian background, but we're not talking a specific denomination or anything like that. We're talking about values that are common across the board. And until we get back to that and get away from, only this group can do it, or only that group can do it, or only that group can do it, we're not going to go forward. Now we might sustain ourselves for another few years, but eventually we're going to find and say, what in the world happened? And then you have a cycle, especially with education. You're talking of 25 to 30 years to catch up after you've turned the corner. They did a study, and I had it on my program when we were here, Why do so many teachers not make it through the first 5 years? They want to. They're compassionate. They want to teach the kids. And yes, they have to do all these other things. And even more so, they don't get enough feedback and backing from the system, whether it's from the parents or from the administration or the community as such. And, you know, in that regard, going back to years ago, it was the community that everything was there for education. That was the center of everything. And we got to get that mindset back. And that includes work then. Because if you have it, whatever the education is, if you have that, you'll know what's going on. I got to go back to my grandfather coming in. He came in 1883 from Norway. And when we were over in Norway, I asked, you know, Grandpa, in addition to working on the farm, they had side jobs sometimes. And he was a good blacksmith. He also made his own skis and all that stuff. And I said, you know, why was he a good blacksmith? And he says, oh, every child in Norway at that time had to learn how to be a good blacksmith. Yeah, and they had to learn how to bend the wood to make the skis. It was just part of the curriculum. It was part of the survival, and it was revered. Mm-hmm. It was, you know, if you did, it didn't matter if you skied or not, you had to know how to do it. Mm-hmm. And you know, it came in handy down through the years. So.
Well, it's such a complicated issue, which would be made less complicated, I think, if we would all of us spend a little more time in introspection, reflection, and honest analysis of the world around us. For example, the way we rank order work is detrimental. The Christian point of view on it, that all work is of equal value, is something that we should aspire to. Yep. Because once you say this job is more important than this job is more important than this job, then pay is commensurate with it, and all of a sudden you find yourself paying the most for the culturally least important jobs sometimes. And we can all come up with ideas about that. So also in the education sphere. The most important in terms of affecting children for the future are the elementary school teachers. Right. Certainly they have the hardest work, the most demanding work, and the most important work, and they're paid the least, and by rank order as you go up you get paid more, where the importance of it as well as the difficulty of it in many ways decreases. We pay the teachers the worst, the lower level administrators more, the higher level administrators the most. It's an inverting of a huge labor pyramid. And so even when we rank order, we tend to rank order upside down in our culture. So let's just work for sort of getting rid of the rank order. Your job is as important as my job in God's eyes, the moral issue, and we should affirm it, esteem it, encourage it, and support it, and not demean it.
And that's why I have questions about paying teachers on performance. We've been there, and there's an easy way to do that. You make sure that you have all the good students, and then they'll get better, and you'll get more pay. And it has nothing to do with the fact that who's going to teach these disadvantaged students, who's going to teach these students where they come from poor, and yet are very, very bright. And it just brings so many questions in my mind, because we have to, I think, have evaluation based on what you said. The moral issue is, how do we get students to perform and just work about education and talking about work as a God-given sense of well-being for the person?
Yes, so, if I can just break in a second, for those who may be viewing this who have a different point of view, a more conservative point of view, although I think our conversation has been extremely conservative. Yes. But David Brooks, a conservative editorialist for the New York Times, had just an excellent editorial a few days ago based on commencement addresses, all of which basically accentuate the importance of me, what I want. And he ended up saying, remember, all of this sort of violates what the United States is all about.
Amen.
We are only enhanced in ourselves to the degree that we give of ourselves on behalf of others. And that's God's view of labor, and that's why it is defined in Scripture as such a positive thing, because God knows perfectly that as we give of ourselves, we ourselves receive much more than we give. And yet we are in a culture where we're constantly talking about what can I get, how much money can I make, how much power can I have, just the opposite of that which actually works toward the common good. And so I'd recommend everybody look up David Bruch's, read his editorial the first last week in May, and little by little you see this kind of conversation creeping into the public domain these days, an honest attempt to try to turn our thinking away from such exclusive individuality to a much more comprehensive common good.
And that, I think, is a high note to end on. And that really sums up what we've been wanted to discuss today. So I thank everybody for listening, and I hope that sparks some thoughts in your mind. And, you know, there are many good books to read on all these subjects, including the Bible.
Including the Bible.
Yeah. So, thank you.
Thank you.